Say you're interested in a high-performance hybrid along the lines of a Porsche 918 perhaps, but your budget doesn't quite stretch to $1 million, but it does stretch to a late model GT2 or GT3. Vonnen has the perfect solution for you because they have a new performance hybrid system that can be grafted onto just about any Porsche performance vehicle from about 2009 onwards. We're talking 911, we're talking Boxster, we're talking Cayman as well. The model right in front of me is a 2013 base 911 that has had 150 horsepower added to it. Now I know what you're thinking, why would you want to add 150 horsepower to a base 911? Well, this is just a proof of concept vehicle, and you can add 150 horsepower to any 911 that you want. You could take a GT2 or a GT3 or a 911 that you have modified yourself. Say you've already invested a ton of cash into bigger turbos, an ECU upgrade in the back. You could add 150 horsepower to that model and make it even faster. And because of the way electric vehicle and hybrid systems interact with the car versus the average turbo upgrade, you're going to get a very different experience than simply swapping turbos out on your 911. That's because turbos need to spool up, and electric motors are going to give you instant torque at those very low RPMs. So the two systems actually work very well with one another. So if you're planning on some serious upgrades to your 911, you should think about this kind of a system. Basically what's going on is they've inserted a pancake electric motor between the engine and the transmission in the back, and then there's a battery up front. This is the same sort of thing that we see, interestingly enough, in Porsche's own hybrids. Instead of diving under the hood, I have something better. We have an engine right here out of a Porsche Boxster. Let's talk about how the system integrates. Right here we have the electronics module here. This is the inverter, the charger controller, etc. for the battery. This is what's providing power to the electric motor. The electric motor is going to go right here between the engine and the transmission. So if we slide these things apart, you can see in this opening, this is normally where we would have a flywheel or a flex plate, whatever you want to call it. Clutch packs or manual transmission would be right in there. And they're inserting a 150 horsepower electric motor. This produces about 150 pound-feet of torque as well. And it's going to go right here in that area. You can see it just bolts right up to the engine there. And then the transmission would then slide right back into place. One of the key benefits to this system is because this is such a slim insertion point and because of the relationship between the 911, the Boxster, the Cayman, etc., it can fit equally as well in either of those vehicles. You can tell that this particular setup is a mid-engine design because the exhaust is going back towards the rear. Obviously, trying to make the system as light as possible was very important when crafting this system, but there is going to be a weight penalty. There's just no way around that. That weight penalty should come in right around 160 or perhaps a little bit more pounds. It really depends on what car you're putting it on. Now, the motor is obviously going to add a little bit of weight, but they've also taken weight out of this area because it no longer has a starter motor, so the motor is going to act as the starter in this system. They've also removed the flywheel in that area and replaced it with a slightly lighter weight component. Overall, most of the weight is going to happen likely in the battery pack, which is in the front of the vehicle. The rest of the magic happens right up here in the front trunk. If we come in closer for a look, things look very normal on first appearance. But if we lift up the cover here, you notice that that is where the battery pack and some of the cooling system sits. So we still have access to the front trunk. You still could put a 22-inch roller bag right in here, but you aren't going to fit some of that larger luggage that you might be able to otherwise do in a 911. Still, I think that's a pretty small penalty to pay for an extra 150 horsepower, and most importantly, probably about a full second off your 0 to 60 time. Now, for this particular model, that may not sound that impressive, but if you're adding this to a 911 that already has 500 horsepower, getting up to 650 horsepower and having a relatively small weight penalty is a pretty big deal. So obviously the first thing we need to do is turn the system off so we can get a really good idea of how this particular 911 feels out on the road. And we have the typical Porsche driving dynamics, of course, engines in the back, so most of the weight's in the rear. That's one of the nice benefits to this particular edition is that it doesn't change the weight balance of the car very much. Even though we do get extra weight up front, we also get extra weight in the rear as well. So likely this probably has a very slight effect on overall weight balance, but you're never really going to notice it out on the road. And in my mind, adding a little bit of extra weight in the front of a 911 is never really that bad of a thing. I know a lot of you are really going to complain about that, but hey, that's just the way I think. One thing that's worth noting is that the 12-volt battery does get downsized, and that's part of why the front weight does not change too much. That's because it's not going to use the starter motor anymore. The 12-volt battery is just there for the electrical system that's running the radios, the engine control systems, all that sort of stuff. They haven't done anything to the alternator, so we still have a 12-volt system that is completely separate. They did that for simplicity's sake, so that way they don't have quite as many modifications to deal with. I think it would be interesting, however, at some future point to see exactly what this would be like if they could remove that alternator and perhaps balance the weight out a little bit more. Could cost more, but it might balance that weight out just a little bit. Now, if you're out on your favorite winding mountain road, that's when we're going to want to turn the system on. Now the system's engaged and we're in the stealth mode, which means that if we apply perhaps more than 20 or 30% throttle, then we're going to get some additional assist out of the system. This is going to make things feel natural and sporting out on your favorite winding mountain road. You can hear a little bit of that electric motor whine as the motor kicks in, and of course you'll see it right there on the app as well. They've really nicely integrated the regen braking. I'm surprised by that actually, because a lot of companies struggle with the balance of friction braking and regen braking, but they've done a pretty good job here. It doesn't feel very intrusive. The other thing that I've noticed, if we were to expand this little graphic down here, is that the system really seems to be targeted towards recharging the battery pretty aggressively. So that's very different than the average hybrid out there, which is not really focused on performance, but is more focused on fuel economy. Perhaps later we'll be able to see a few modes where we can change things around, but one of the advantages to this system out on a track or even out on your favorite winding mountain road is going to be the regen braking, because clearly if we're consuming some of that kinetic energy, turning it into electricity, putting it back in the battery, you're not going to be using your friction brakes quite as much. That means less brake overheating. We didn't talk about battery capacity just yet, but the capacity of the battery pack is right around 1 kilowatt hour, so it's not too far off what we see in a lot of mainstream hybrids, but again, it's being used very differently. Now, when it's being used in the manner that we're seeing in this vehicle, if you were to floor it on, for instance, a drag strip or a really, really long drag strip, you could exhaust the battery in about 15 to 16 seconds or so, but that's definitely going to get you beyond the quarter mile, so this is still going to be useful even if you plan on doing things like drag racing your 911. If we switch the system over to the overboost mode, then it's going to be a little bit more aggressive at using the battery power, but of course, you're going to have to dig a little bit deeper into the throttle in order to get that particular action out of the system. So it's not going to work in stop and go traffic for you unless you plan on really leapfrogging the stop and go traffic around you, but it is very interesting. It seems like this mode is primarily designed for drag strip applications or just applications where you want the maximum oomph out of the system pretty much at the command of your right foot. And then we get the sport mode, which is tuned somewhere in between. You have to be a little bit less aggressive on the throttle in order to get response from the system, but the response is a little bit more aggressive than it was in stealth mode. They're telling us this mode was really designed for on-track use, or logically your favorite winding mountain road with a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit like the one that we're on right here. Don't worry, we're not speeding. It would actually be pretty hard, even in this car, to actually speed on this particular road. But perhaps the best thing I can say about the system is if we put it back into stealth mode, how unobtrusive overall it really is. I was actually expecting something a little bit rougher around the edges, because a lot of other hybrid conversions that I've seen, or even some homegrown electric vehicles that were produced by companies that were a lot bigger than Vonnen, haven't really been as polished as this system. If you're in stealth mode and you're just driving it around town, it feels very much like your regular 911. And in stealth mode, even though it's adding extra boost here and there, and it's giving you a little bit of regen braking here and there, it doesn't really feel any different. The only thing I did notice is that when you're slowing down to a stoplight, the liftoff regen is perhaps a little bit more aggressive than the natural engine braking that we get in the 911, but you're probably not going to notice that after the first mile or two. Now, what does the system do for you in terms of overall 0 to 60 performance? Well, depending on the model that you put it on, you could expect at least a 1-second improvement. That's a pretty powerful statement, because remember that if you were to do simply an ECU swap, you probably won't get a 1-second improvement on any of the 911s. And not that this is an enormous consideration, of course, but you might likely get a slightly better fuel economy average in your 911 with this particular modification on it. Now, don't have any confirmation of that at all. That's just inside my head. Regen braking is obviously going to have at least some benefit for you, but rationally, people that are interested in this system don't care about fuel economy at all, and they're all about performance. Bottom line, out on the road, this is a seamlessly integrated solution that I really was surprised by, because again, I wasn't expecting something that was quite this polished out of a system that just barely went on sale. So if you're looking for a little bit of extra oomph and you don't want to change the character of your 911, this is going to be an excellent option. And that changing of character thing is something that I find really important with modifications like this, because even ECU changes change the way that the vehicle delivers power. And this, you get a lot more thrust, but if you want to turn it off and you want to regain that character of your 911, you simply hit a button and your changes are gone. If you want to get your hands on one of Vonnen's shadow drive systems for your late model Porsche, they are available right now, so you should definitely head over to their website. They will set you back about $75,000, but that price tag is all inclusive, of course, accepting the donor Porsche right here. So insert your 911 into that process. $75,000 later, you've got 150 extra horsepower. A key consideration, and one of the more interesting things I think, is for those air-cooled customers, because if you live in California after 1975, you have to have your vehicle smogged, and you're not supposed to be making any changes to the engine or systems that would affect emissions. And this system does not alter the emissions profile of the engine at all. Now, whether that makes this truly CARB compliant, I can't really say at this exact moment. I'm not a lawyer. There's probably some additional adjudication that has to be done, but I would suspect, logically, if you have a 1975 or newer Porsche and you add this system and then you go in to get it smog checked, it's not going to be a problem because it did not change the emissions compliance systems in any way. And it's not an engine swap. So if you were to take one of those other Porsches and you were to swap out the engine with a newer engine, then you definitely have some smog considerations to consider. With all that together, let me know what you think about this down there in the comment section below. And for more information, go to vonnen.com. I will see you all later.